don't get a good night's sleep? How about that Chautauqua? That wonderful glimpse into the world of the Roosevelt administration and the kind of music that was floating around. It's astonishing to me to think that he was an advocate of Theodore Duncan. You could never, I'm going to start with Kathleen on that. You could, and I want to keep this moving fast, and this is your chance to ask questions, because this is we only have a little more than an hour, and then we have to go out, and we have extraordinary people here, and none of them has had enough time with you and so on, so we don't want to waste any time. But Kathleen, let me start with this. When you think about Roosevelt being the champion of Isadora Duncan and being the patron of Edwin Arlington Robinson and having Pablo Casals to the White House, some of that's Edith, but you can never typecast Roosevelt. There's so many, he eludes any easy characterization. So pull a mic up and talk about that.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I really enjoyed that performance last night, and TR believed in sort of cultural nationalism, that idea that America shouldn't be just having English literature, that there was an American literature and an American art and American art forms that should be celebrated by the president. Can you hear me way back there?
Try to be right up in front.
Okay. Well, the idea that an American president would be an advocate for the arts, and to see that as part of his nationalism. America should have its own literature taught at Columbia. He was friends with Brander Matthews, a literature professor. He talked with Richard Watson Gilder about encouraging American arts and making America kind of a world-class culture. And today that seems like, well, why would you need to do that? Everybody recognizes America as a world-class culture, but in 1900, there were ways in which America was still colonial, still a derivative of English arts and letters. And so American literature wasn't taught in many universities. And so he was really an advocate for that. And I find that, when I discovered that working on my book, I thought that was, who knew that about Theodore Roosevelt? He was such a many-sided man. We're always discovering new things.
So questions for any or all of our people? This is your chance to raise any question you please, or to find some clarification on what you heard. Jeffrey, let me start with you then while we wait. Sum up a little bit. You started, you were the keynote, you've been listening to all of this. How do we place TR in the progressive movement? Or say whatever you please.
I don't know if I'm speechless because of the question or because of just the beauty of the morning, and kind of, I've never been out here, and coming out on the bus and suddenly on the right-hand side seeing the country open up with the Badlands like that. So, we've been talking a lot about reform, and we started talking about war, and we got into culture and things like that. So, how to sum some of those things up? I'd like to return to what we were talking about. I think about the nonpartisan league and how that fits in its relationship to Roosevelt. And listening yesterday, I learned quite a bit about some things about the nonpartisan league from everyone who was talking. That I didn't really know about. But it seems to me that I would want to draw, despite Roosevelt's engagement in the early phases with the nonpartisan league, with its economic agenda, I'd want to, maybe this is already there, but I'd want to really heighten the contrast between Roosevelt's basic approach to economic issues, and particularly what I think is so critical for farm movements is the financial system. And to sharpen that distinction between what the Nonpartisan League, where they were going, where the Populist Party, not so much Bryan, but the Populist Party was going, and Roosevelt on issues of banking and how the nation's financial system could be. Because I would think that in the end, despite some engagement by Roosevelt that was friendly at first with the idea of the war then coming in and being what really shows his eventual antipathy toward the Nonpartisan League, I would still want to say that in the end, their approach was always going to be fundamentally at odds on a number of things. The government's role in owning certain kinds of things, running certain kinds, but especially banking and finance, which seem to be so critical. And one last little thing on this is, it's often thought that the real capstone of progressive era reform of the financial system, the banking system, is the Federal Reserve, which was passed in 1913. And I don't know for sure what NPL figures' view of the Federal Reserve was, but a lot of former populists just loathed it. And they thought that this was a conspiracy of the big banking interests, to continue to control everything as against the interests of farmers.
Kim, do you want to talk about that?
I also want to respond.
Good.
Well, I can't actually speak to someone like Townley and the Federal Reserve, but what always strikes me when I hear other people talk about the NPL or other folks talk about the progressive movement is that they so often put the progressive movement in one pile and the NPL in the other pile as some sort of radical, left-wing folks on the northern Great Plains, and you kind of hear that the Montana militia mutterings in the background that perhaps these were somewhat strange individuals, but I think they often are branded by the broader swath of some of the anti-war socialist aspects that gets someone like A.C. Townley in federal penitentiary, or something that gets Kate Richards O'Hare a visit to the penitentiary. But I think if you look at them, particularly in their early phases, they're clearly part of that progressive movement, expanding the electorate, limiting the hours of work for women and children, encouraging home ownership for the more of the working class folks. And the one thing I try to stress when I teach this period to my students at UND is that, yes, you may have come with a certain mindset NPL, but that mindset NPL is not the NPL that they thought they were creating. It takes on a somewhat different life than what many of your grandfathers or great-grandfathers or fill in the appropriate generation. I've had to change that a couple times now. But it's that strong progressivism that so many people don't actually tie to this area of the country that really appeals to me. And that might not be a direct response to the questions of the Federal Reserve. There are clearly strong concerns about the money, who is controlling it, and that if we want to control it best, we'll have our own bank and, I don't know, we'll build something that somebody else will steal brickstone later in the century.
In 1916, you may know this, the Roosevelt branch of the Nonpartisan League came to Sagamore Hill and met with TR, and he spoke kindly about their program. So I agree with Kimberly that, in fact, what Theodore Roosevelt was one kind of progressive, the Nonpartisan League was another kind. They, in that early phase that Clay outlined yesterday, in the early phase, they saw a common ground. And in 1916, they were speaking some of the same language. So I think his attempt in 1910, during the Osawatomie speech, was to take the prairie radicalism in all its form and marry it to social justice, progressivism, and to try to take the activity of Midwestern progressives of many stripes and make a national movement out of it. So again, before the U.S. intervention in World War I occurs in April 1917, there was a chance that these folks could talk together and work together. So I think even after that, in one of his last speeches in 1918, Theodore Roosevelt advocates farm collectives, and a lot of the programs that the NPL advocated. So even though he might denounce Townley and accept some of that sort of characterization of La Follette that was very unfair, and talk about Huns within our gates, which is, I agree with Clay, it was one of the most unattractive phases of his as NFT. One of them, it was really the worst, I think, TR ever got, with that saying, anybody who's not 100% American is disloyal and should be hanged out on the common. That was a really ugly moment in TR's career. But to his dying day, he was arguing for things that the NPL supported, and he also accepted a lot of populist ideas at the end. But banking regulation and the Federal Reserve, I'm not sure how much all of these people are on record, because that was a pretty complicated reform.
But you know, early on in the NPL, they win partially in 1916, and in 1917 they didn't have both houses of the North Dakota legislature, but that 1917 legislature nevertheless passed a great number of the Progressive Party's agenda. So they were doing things that would be regarded as conservative within their own ranks, but they were able to accomplish them because there was a strong progressive spirit even in the non-NPL people in North Dakota in 1917. Then in 1919, they go to the more radical agenda of the NPL, where some people like Roosevelt begin to have doubts about state socialist enterprises like mills and elevators and banks. But it's amazing how many if you look at the progressive agenda and then the NPL agenda, there's an enormous overlap until you get into the war and get into the more extreme socialist approaches.
You may remember this from my book, that in 1918, when Theodore Roosevelt reads the British program, the national minimums, the British Labour Party program, he does not dismiss it all out of hand. He's willing to consider public ownership of mines and forests and some natural resources. So that means that he didn't think that maybe railroads should be owned publicly, but he wasn't hostile to all forms of public ownership. So that puts him in a very different place from a lot of other national politicians.
So we want to know, I suppose, what would have happened had there been no World War I, but that's counterfactual. So there were questions, I think, starting back here. Who has one? Yes?
There was some talk about the relationship with La Follette, his father, and his father's death at an early age. And there was also in Quentin's death and the effects that it had on Roosevelt with regard to this radical change. What about Roosevelt's father when he passed away, and also his mother and Alice? Did that have any causal effect as kind of the reform?
The questions about parents and children, so La Follette and his father. First of all, Nancy, you start because we were all, but I want to get you to clear this up a little. Everyone was so amazed when you said that La Follette had his father exhumed and he examined the body and so on.
Yeah, but see, I know the answer to this one. I want to hear Kathleen's answer, but I'll answer the La Follette one, because that's a really good question. With La Follette, because he had this mother that I mentioned who was just saying, you know, your father was this great man, you must always live up to him. And he really agonizes over Well, he has to live up to his father's ideals, but he doesn't know this father. It's really hard to live up to the ideals of somebody you don't know. And so there was not a photograph that existed of his father, and there's a few books. There's really not a whole lot there. All he knows for sure is that his father was an agnostic, which is rare in those days. He gets a stepfather who's a big deacon in the church and who beats the crap out of La Follette all the time and tells him that his father is burning in hell for his agnosticism. So it's interesting to me how there's ripples of this that continue on. La Follette never belongs to a church after that, which is very unusual for a U.S. senator. And at one point, he doesn't make a big deal out of this because it's not what most people expect. But when people say to him, "So, Senator, where do you worship?" he would always say, "Well, most recently I was at," and then he'd say whatever church he'd just been to a funeral. I was at St. Timothy's. Most recently I was whatever. And finally some reporter stops him and says, "Look, what are your religious beliefs?" And La Follette really lets them have it and says, "I don't see how this is any of your business. I am an American. I have religious freedom. I have freedom from religion." I mean, he really lays this whole thing out. It's very unusual. So I really see, and he read the Bible, he used to quote it, he sent his kids to Sunday school. He wasn't anti-religion, but for himself, he was not a religious person. I think that was part of his sort of honoring his father. But to answer the question, because he wants to know so much about this man, that's why he has the grave exhumed. His mother has just died. He's going to have them buried side by side. So he has his father's grave dug up. He goes out with the gravedigger. He collects all the relics. All right, it's been like 40 years. And he takes him to the family doctor. They lay him out. All right, and they talk about, "Oh, his hair was redder than I thought," because they find a hank of hair. This is really pretty gross, I know, and they're talking about how long the bones are and how tall he must have been. I mean, this was a man desperate to know more about this father, and so I think that without reducing him, because we're all complex people, and I don't want to reduce him to this relationship, but I do think it played an important role in his refusal to compromise, his desire to always be righteous. And I think it really had an impact on his religious life and his attitudes towards religion.
And if they started with hair, that makes sense with La Follette. Am I going to lose my hair? How did Dad's hair hold up? Is this the end of my career?
No, hair was huge with La Follette. In his papers, there's different recipes for hair tonic. I mean, it's all about it.
Kathleen, this is a thick subject, TR and his father, TR and his children, but go ahead.
Well, I'll try to just be brief. I think when Theodore Roosevelt loses his wife Alice and his daughter is born, that really is an occasion. He's still in the state legislature and he needs to finish the session, but he really buries himself out here, and even though he already owned the ranches, but North Dakota becomes his spiritual home, his rejuvenation, his retreat, his place of mourning, and his friends here really are very important to him. So I'd say that it takes him a while. He grieves very heavily here, and what he writes about when he comes here in 1884 is very sad stuff. Riding alone in the lonely prairies, and it's worth reading, and it's worth looking at that period in his time. It's a very sad moment, and he faces his tremendous sense of loss over Alice. So I guess he's very much affected by family issues. I think one of the implicit arguments in my book is the personal equation is really important with TR, and the death of his father when TR is in college is quite a big blow for him, because he adored that father. His father was the best man I ever knew, he said in his autobiography, and he worshipped him. So Thee had been in a big reform fight against bosses just before he died, and I think TR looked at that, and part of him said, well, politics killed my father, it's complicated, but also he saw his father in heroic terms fighting the evil bosses. And that probably, in the long run, becomes a career decision for him, which is, I want to redeem my father's political idealism, I want to carry it on. But TR also suffers, not the way that La Follette suffered with his father's death. He doesn't exhume the bones, but he does, he acts a little bit erratically in grief, and so challenges people to a duel, and gets into fights and does a little bit more drinking than he normally would have done. But he gets over it, and it's a very sad period in his life. So TR mourning is, especially as a young man, it's a pretty heavy burden for him. But
And just quickly, this is an impossible question to answer so briefly, but Kim Porter was talking yesterday about the death of Quentin and its effect on TR in the last year of his life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
well, I think Kim really had a point, which is that TR was excessively vitriolic towards conscientious objectors. He called them slackers, and was in sympathy with the raids on conscientious objectors and people who avoided the draft in New York. There were some, kind of vigilante type people who would go and grab people who had avoided the draft, and TR supported that. So that, that was soon after Quentin's death, and it's clear that TR really suffered when Quentin was shot down in France, and in July and August of 1918, his letters are full of grief. He goes up to Dark Harbor, Islesboro, with his daughter Ethel, and he and Edith just avoid publicity because the newspapers are all over him that summer. What does Colonel Roosevelt say about this? Have you heard any more news about your son? They're just plaguing him, and he just goes up and plays with his grandchildren and sits on the porch. So, again, this is a real moment, and I completely agree with your interpretation that the nastiness with which he attacked the Nonpartisan League and some other folks who had questions about the war may have had a lot to do with his own loss, and the guilt feelings that he obviously had about sending sons to battle and having them killed because of his insistence that they go. It was not optional for Roosevelt's sons to go to war. Sons of Theodore Roosevelt went to war.
I think that was one of the things I was going to emphasize as well, is that there wasn't a choice for any of Roosevelt's sons whether they were going. It was when they were going. And I've always had a certain sympathy for poor Kermit. Not only does he get dragged through Africa on the safari, he gets dragged through South America, ultimately ends up a suicide, but he feels enough pressure that he volunteers for the British Army prior to the American involvement in the war. And I think a great deal of this gets back to this, you will be blooded. It's this whole idea that a man needs to be a man, and whenever you hear of any conflict with him and with Theodore, the president, and the father, the grandfather, one of the things that usually comes out is one of his disappointments was that his father had not served in the Civil War. Well, he'd served in his own way, but he had not served as a soldier, and so he leaves Edith very ill to go to the Spanish-American War, and at one point he says, in essence, "I'm sorry, but I'm going," and this is what's going to happen. And so I think there's something, and I'm not truly into psychobiography, but it seems clearly in his last few months he realizes that in some ways his own belligerence, his own militancy has sent his sons, all of his sons and his son-in-law to be in peril. And of course Quentin does die, and Archie and Ted Jr. are both wounded. So I think that's a significant burden for him to bear. And anybody that reads the letters post Quentin's death, anyone who reads the columns post-death, there's just a change. Clearly something has occurred, and
With respect to the Spanish-American War, T.R. later said of Edith's illness that she had had major surgery in the autumn of 1897, and T.R. said he would have left her deathbed to go off to war. Now, he maybe was posturing a little bit, but he said it. Frank?
Yeah, I think you can see this reflected in Theodore Jr. as well. I mean, he suffers serious wounds in the First World War and serves in the Second. He really didn't have to. And then he insisted on going ashore with his men at D-Day. At first, his first several requests were denied, and he insisted he was going to go. He went ashore with his men. He was walking on sticks at that point in his life, and he won the Medal of Honor. So this is something I think you see in the Roosevelt family. Teddy, and this was part of his makeup and part of his son's makeup. I often wonder what it must have been like. Topic we had a couple of years ago, the family growing up Roosevelt. What it must have been like to grow up as a son of a man like Theodore Roosevelt, and particularly for the son who bore his name. That must have been a particular burden.
Yes.
Let's go back to the question of the relationship between NPL and the progressive movement. It seems to me the progressive movement is basically built on an embrace of the market economy as the basic organizing theme for economic activity, whereas the NPL is basically socialism, and views socialism as the organizing principle.
I think that's wrong.
Repeat the question.
Oh, okay. I think you're asserting that the NPL wants a total socialist system, and I think that's wrong. I think they were willing to accept, as the British Labour Party did, certain public ownerships to ameliorate some of the harshest aspects of capitalism. But I don't think that the Nonpartisan League was thoroughly socialist. I think it was, it had its banks and the elevator and a few other reforms that, it's like, I think they're continuous with gas and water socialism, which was going around in the progressive era, which is in places like Cleveland. The city government would argue, okay, who should own the sewer system? Should it be public ownership or private ownership? Who should own the roads? Who should own the gas works? Who should own the water? And in some cities, they said, oh, everything should be for profit. Okay, but most cities said public ownership of water, sewer, roads, parks, and other things. That's kind of what we think of as gas and water socialism. And that spread throughout America. And so that municipal ownership of basic utilities was a standard decision. I think the NPL took gas and water socialism and said, we're having a hard time with these grain elevators, we're having a hard time with these railroads. They took that from the populace. We're going to extend gas and water socialism, but we're not thinking about government ownership of production. We're not thinking about government ownership of anything else. So I think one of the things that when I teach international students, they always say, oh, well, Americans call each other communists and socialists randomly, but they don't really understand the boundaries. The boundaries are little gas and water socialism is kind of an adjustment to our capitalist system. And I think the NPL was doing that. I don't think they were like the Socialist Party. And there are times when the Socialist Party in America sounds like just a labor union. They're not that radical. And it's not really until you get a Communist Party, which of course we suppress very quickly, that you get much more, let's own the means, let's have the government own the means of production. So now, there are bigger experts on the Nonpartisan League here and here who may or may not agree with me seeing it.
I do agree. I mean, it seems to me that the NPL was really very pragmatic, that there were certain problems that they were trying to solve. How do you make sure the railroads don't charge confiscatory rates? How do you make sure that there isn't dockage in your grain? How do you make sure that the grading practices are accurate and honest? How do you get credit in rural America when there is no federal credit system? And so they wanted to solve a set of problems, and they tried to do things from within the existing political structure, and when they eventually were driven out by despair, and when they came to power, they created those parts of a program that they thought, solve the problem. And I don't think that they were ideological socialists. There were a few socialists in their midst, but they were really trying to solve a specific set of problems, beginning with how do you come to power in a one-party state. And so their primary insurgency was brilliant, and their program was, if the problem didn't exist, we wouldn't be here. But the problem does exist, so we'll take what measures we need to, and it looks like we're going to have our own terminal elevator, because the only way we can get fairness is to do that, and the only way we can get credit is to create our own bank. But if there had been a less severe solution, I'm sure they would have taken it.
I think one of the issues that's tucked away in here is that all of these men had the opportunity to join the Socialist Party. Townley may or may not have been a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party. He clearly worked with the Socialist Party. We had Clay's presentation yesterday afternoon about him traveling the state in Model Ts and getting folks to sign up. But folks were not signing up for the Socialist Party. They were signing up for a newspaper and amelioration. They were not looking to have the state take over the means of production. They'd worked too dang hard to get that farm, and they were going to hold on to that farm. But what they wanted was the end of railroad control, was the end of Miller elevator control, and the gas and water socialism works out quite clearly. You don't need gas and water to be state-owned, city-owned in North Dakota for success. You need the elevator, the mill, and some control of the railroads.
Jeffrey?
But I want to, to me the issue isn't so much as the nonpartisan league socialist or not, but I do think the point I raised initially about, to me, one of the most critical things is banking and finance. And I really think that the nonpartisan leagues, the way they imagine setting up a state bank of North Dakota, and that's a quite different initial vision. It's not just a bank that works, within the banking system we have now. It was, if you extended that, it really was a threat to private banking. And it was socialization of credit. And I would say that that's fairly radical, and that I don't think Roosevelt can accept that ideologically. And I do think that at that point, co-ops and a terminal elevator maybe are one thing in terms of pragmatic, state within a federalist system, solving practical problems. But if you start imagining an economy where credit, the provision of credit is becoming socialized, which is really what they're doing, I think that's very serious threat to banking interests in the finance system. And I think this is, to me, what makes populism, what makes it much more radical than free silver, which is that what populists were proposing really was to have the government loan money directly to people and to print money to do it, to farmers. And
but let me
those
just
kinds of proposals really are deeply threatening to a private system of credit.
But keep in mind that the NPO never advocated socializing the entire credit system of North Dakota. They were perfectly happy to have all of the commercial banks continue, but they would have an alternative bank, the existence of which would force other banks to be more fair in their lending practices. They didn't intend to socialize the entire mill and elevator system of North Dakota, but to have their own mill so that there would be an alternative of some sort to the existing system.
I might add that in 1915, when the Nonpartisan League was founded, banks were charging farmers 12% interest as a standard practice. So it's really understandable that they wanted a bank that the state could regulate and have reasonable interest rates. What was going on is a colonial situation that Clay described, which is that Minnesota financial institutions were really raking in just unbelievable profits from loaning money to poor farmers in North Dakota. So I don't think they thought beyond their own emergency. I don't think they were trying to socialize America. I think they were trying to get a bank that would give them decent interest rates, and if the state was the one that would do that, that's what they wanted. So I think they're very concrete in their aims, and I think they're less radical than populist. Would you say no?
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
One of the things I would say about the Nonpartisan League's formation in 1915 is it comes out of a failure to respond to a direct request by the citizenry of North Dakota for a terminal elevator. And this is supposedly when our friend Treadwell Twitchell, that almost seems like it has to be a maiden name, that Treadwell Twitchell says, may or may not have said, go home and slop your hogs.
He denied it for the rest of his life.
Yeah, he denied it for the rest of his life, but it still makes it great. If you're teaching freshmen, it's a good line. And there's a lot of good lines, the rolling down the hill and the signing the John Hancock.
Didn't get his check.
Yeah, but the Nonpartisan League, or the men who become the founders of the Nonpartisan League, had no reason to trust their state government because it had clearly denied what an initiative had brought forth to say that there would be a terminal elevator. So you got to try something. If the first try doesn't work.
Go ahead.
Thank you. In a prior career, I spent a lot of time looking at abstracts, title, farmland abstracts, and during that period of time, many of the farmers were mortgaging their farms every year. They'd mortgage them for a crop and repay it at the end of the year, and oftentimes it might be a neighbor, but in many cases it was insurance companies. And we rarely saw a bank finance a farm. And I think that's probably the reason is they were charging such high interest rates. But can you comment on, when did that change? Because I think at that time land was so low in its value, you couldn't capitalize the operating farm.
So the question is about the alternatives to bank credit for farms and the repeated mortgaging, sometimes by insurance companies or neighboring farms and so on. I mean, one way to look at that would be that there was not yet an infrastructure in North Dakota to really handle this. There's also the suggestion that land values were low, and so there was no incentive for banks to give this credit.
Well, Clay you may be the person to answer this, but my understanding is that the Nonpartisan League reforms help people, at least for a few years, and that the 20s was a very complicated time for farmers. A lot of people went out of business because there were, commercialized farming was coming in, large kind of farm conglomerates, but there was too much production and not enough demand in the 20s. So my guess is that the reforms made it easier for people in places like North Dakota to survive for a while. But as my grandfather found, you could fail at wheat farming several times, and it's still, the conditions were still not getting really easy. It was a hard way to make a living. There are a few people in the audience who are descendants of nonpartisan leaders, and I think that's a wonderful thing that they're here.
Well, let me ask a big question that sort of takes us out, because I have a feeling that Sharon's going to come here any second and grab my throat, and I always wish we had more time, but we need to go out and see the farm. But what happens to causes when they succeed? The Nonpartisan League has a program, and that program is the 5 points, and they get them all. And they also, in 1917, enacted a whole slew of wider progressive reforms And so when you get women's suffrage, and when you get the 8-hour workday, and when you get a child labor law, and when you get workmen's compensation, these causes that coalesced into progressivism, now we've achieved it. What happens? How do you maintain the fervor of progressivism when you accomplish as much as happened between 1912 and 1925?
Well, in North Dakota's case, you throw the rascals out. If you look at the recall election and the referendum election in October of 1921, the folks who have taken or attempting to retake control of the Republican Party, the Independent Voters Association and the Citizens Economy League, managed to toss the members of the Industrial Commission, most notably Governor Frazier, but they also choose to keep what are sometimes referred to as the 5 bills to state socialism, with the mill, the elevator, the Industrial Commission, hail insurance, housing, and probably went on hail housing. The 5 bills, they throw the rascals out, basically making a comment on the leadership, but they keep the bills, keep them in place, but the new leadership is going to take a somewhat watered down version of the NPL agenda, but they like what they've seen, they just don't particularly like Cameron.
But Jeffrey, about when these causes get satisfied, then how do you maintain? It's not a party; it's a movement. And so how do you sustain these movements over time when they have successes?
Well, I mean, I do think that is difficult, and I think Kim's answer to that is part of it. In my case of populism, since they really didn't succeed, you don't really have to worry about that quite so much. And you have to think, did they have any positive effect in failing?
Go ahead.
Well, with some of the progressive reformers, the Supreme Court strikes down the child labor amendment, so they have to come back again and fight for that. For other things, they get women's suffrage, and they organize the League of Women Voters and try to get a lot of women to vote. Well, that's a hard struggle because women haven't been voting. Women are very much divided in the 20s over should we have protective legislation, should we have an equal rights amendment. So there's sort of a stage 2 to a lot of progressive reform movements, which is they may win a particular law, but there are larger causes that are still troubling to them. Jane Addams, for example, hopes for peace and works in the peace movement and works for disarmament. She's not going to be too successful because after World War I, they're moving towards World War II. So, there are lots of progressive reforms that seem to have some success, but then there are other issues that still remain undone until the New Deal, and even after that, there are things that are still not finished.
I have 2 more questions, one for Nancy and one for Frank, and then we have to go. Sharon's giving me the look, so we'll get on the bus. But I'm sure everyone who heard you yesterday was thinking about Wisconsin, and I've watched this last year the chaos in Wisconsin with curiosity and concern. But after hearing you, it was more a kind of sense of irony and sadness that the place that was once the laboratory of progressivism has had this turmoil, and there's a gigantic struggle about the future of Wisconsin as a progressive state. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I wrote an op-ed about this. I said Wisconsin's like the little girl who had the curl in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. Wisconsin brings us Bob Follett, it brings us Joe McCarthy. Wisconsin has an ability to lead, it just tends to go in these completely different directions. So, as I mentioned, Saturday I was at the Fighting Bob Fest, and I'd written this talk, don't despair, do all this stuff. Well, Friday was the day the decision came down overturning the ruling about unions. Well, nobody was despairing. They were giddy at the Fighting Bob Fest, so my speech had to be adjusted a little bit. But I think Wisconsin reminds me in some ways of my home state of Washington, where there's a mountain range that cuts Washington in two, and politically it's cut in two. If you're on the western side, the Seattle side, it's very liberal. If you're in Spokane, it's very conservative. It's just, cut right down the middle. And Wisconsin has a lot of that same kind of schizophrenia that's going on. The people who are the old lefties and the progressives, they're still fighting the fight and singing this. They were the ones who were in the square during all those protests. And I must tell you, somebody sent me a picture of all those thousands of protesters in the snow with the publicist from my press carrying a poster of my book through the snow. So I said, yeah, this is the kind of publicist.
Now more than ever.
Yeah, this is the kind of publicist that we want to have. So it's interesting. There are people in Wisconsin who are saying, all these, radicals and lefties, they don't understand the realities of today, and they're going strong. But the group that I know in Wisconsin are the ones who are, attending the Fighting Bob Fest, and I gave my little talk. I had a slide of Paul Ryan. I got boos and hisses, and so it's going to be very interesting to me to see. I mean, many of us said during that recall campaign, look, if you can't have a successful recall, don't even attempt it, because otherwise it looks like we've got a mandate now for Walker and so forth. So I don't have the answer to what's going to happen in Wisconsin, but I'm really eager to see what you can.
But as a
play
historian,
out.
you're saying this schizophrenia is deep
yeah.
in the Wisconsin character.
It really, and it always has been. But there's just been a little flip on who's winning at the moment. So we'll see how long that lasts.
It's not over yet.
Yeah,
We'll
no.
see what happens. Frank,
Yeah.
I know you're not a Brian biographer, but I've been thinking about what makes Brian Brian. How does he become this populist figure? With T.R. La Follette, we have these family issues that might be part of this mix, but what do you think made Brian this person that he was and so extraordinary?
Again, I'm not a Brian biographer, but my feeling about the man is first of all, religion is very close to the surface with him. And I think his Midwest background also, I think he really was the great commoner in many ways. I think it really was important to him that people got a fair deal, a square deal, T.R.'s lexicon. And I think the combination of those things is sort of evangelical fervor and the roots among the common people. And he had this innate sense of drama as well. I mean, he was such a bombastic speaker, so eloquent, so good at turning a phrase, so ready to seize the moment, which he did so effectively at that Democratic National Convention. I mean, he just mesmerized the audience. I got a 30-minute standing ovation. How often do we see that sort of thing happen?
He was a dark horse candidate before he gave the speech, and then he swept to victory.
Exactly, yeah. So I think there's just a sense of drama about the man. And I think he fascinated people then as he does today.
I feel so frustrated that here we are just getting warmed up. Now I want to take a bathroom break and start for another couple of hours. And don't you just want to carry on all day? We have at great expense. We brought together these extraordinary people, and I just hate to stop because it's so interesting when they're mixing it up and slightly disagreeing or reinforcing. And I apologize that we haven't given this as much time as it deserves, but thank all of you for your patience and for sharing. Sharon, tell us what happens next.
This is very easy. Bathroom and bus as quickly as you can do it. The bathrooms are out this door and to the right. They are heated, thank goodness. And if you'll head to the bus, we will meet the bus and the van. So about 10 people will be getting in the van rather than the bus. And they'll be right in the same area over here.